Hello, everyone. This week we're going to be discussing Islamic terrorism. This is probably the type of terrorism that y'all are most familiar with. It's obviously the one that's most often in the news, especially well, since 9/11. It's pretty much been kind of at the forefront. So, kind of as always, I'm going to be discussing the material, the Juergensmeyer book, but there are some additional readings included in Blackboard. The two readings in Blackboard specifically deal with religious reasons for Islamic terrorism. So as you read those two articles, think about how they might apply to the case studies in Juergensmeyer and how the broader concepts within those articles might relate to other case studies we've covered so far. All right, so Juergensmeyer, kind of the first case study he talks about is ISIS. So for years, since 9/11, Al-Qaeda was the main Islamic terrorist group that dominated the news and was responsible for a lot of terrorist attacks around the world. Um, so when you start talking about ISIS kind of spawned uh, out of that movement. But anyway, there's been a lot of debate about whether or not ISIS is actually a terrorist group, or are they an insurgent group, or are they a military force? Um, because of their goals of establishing an Islamic caliphate, acquiring land, kind of the way they went about their business, was very, very different from other Islamic groups such as Al Qaeda. So the question we ask every week needs to be answered in the first couple of pages of the chapter. So was ISIS motivated by power or by religion? So if you look at what Juergensmeyer wrote about several of the refugees that he interviewed, they say that ISIS was all about power, but then used religion to justify it or to use it as an excuse. So ISIS formed, uh, at least in part, due to the U.S.'s invasion of Iraq in 2003. When Saddam Hussein was overthrown, Sunni Arabs in Iraq feared that they would lose power because Saddam had favored them before, even though um, he had a more of a secular regime and not really a religious regime. Religious regime. Boy, I said that 10 times fast. That's not easy. Um, but kind of their prayers were kind of answered in 2004 when a young militant Sunni, al Zarqawi, rose to prominence. So he was kind of the founder of ISIS. And he formed this movement based on the Wahhabi form of Islam, which is a very strict form of Islam that allowed for things like beheadings. And he used those teachings and then played upon the Sunnis wanting to be free of the American military and Shia political domination, who was the most prevalent uh, group, as opposed to the Sunnis. So it was originally called Al Qaeda in Iraq because he wanted to gain support from Osama bin Laden and al Zawahiri. Especially back then, Al Qaeda was pretty strong still at that time. So everybody was wanting to kind of gain support of Al Qaeda. So he originally called his group Al Qaeda in Iraq. But he had a problem. Al Qaeda didn't like ISIS. He didn't like the group's beliefs, their use of brutal tactics. They thought the use of the beheadings and the brutality would really alienate the surrounding population. So al-Zarqawi was killed in 2006. Then the group was essentially defeated and destroyed due to the surge strategy employed by the U.S. with General Petraeus. But once the U.S. started withdrawing the troops in 2011, there was this uprising in Syria. Then al-Baghdadi started rebuilding the army and ended up controlling large sections of Syria. Army being the prior group. So then in 2014, it officially became ISIS. They began taking over more land and expanding throughout the region. So in Juergensmeyer, he argues that it's appropriate to call it a terrorist regime, but he does question how religious it actually was. And there's examples in there that demonstrate that ISIS may not have been as religious as they like to portray themselves as. Also, um, large sections of the Muslim community denounced ISIS as well as being anti-Muslim or not Muslim. But if you look at who the leaders of ISIS were, um, because they claim religious authority for their actions, and al-Baghdadi has a PhD in Islamic studies, from the Islamic University of Baghdad. So obviously, those are some credentials, that lend a little bit of credence to, kind of the religious aspect of this group. But simply having credentials obviously does not make a movement religious. So the jury is still kind of out on how religious ISIS actually was. So then we get to the second case study, and it revolves around the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. So this attack was perpetrated by those that were part of a wider jihadi network that was associated with Al Qaeda. So before ISIS, Al Qaeda again was the most well-known Islamic terrorist group, at least in the West. It was led by Osama bin Laden and claimed responsibility for attacks on U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and then of course the 9/11 attacks. But still, you have this same question: are they a religious organization? If you look at just qualifications, the qualifications of the leaders of Al Qaeda were much less than those of ISIS. Excuse me, Bin Laden was an engineer, or claimed to be an engineer. That really is not, give you any kind of religious, street cred. And then, if you look at this kind of broader thing, you have all these Al Qaeda groups and Al Qaeda this and Al Qaeda that, and you have lots of these kind of spawned off terrorist groups that claim to be affiliated with Al Qaeda or actually part of Al Qaeda. But the question always is, are they? Or are they just kind of naming themselves, kind of like Al Qaeda in Iraq, where they claimed, they picked the name and said they were affiliated, but were they really? So what happens is one of the problems you have when you're trying to establish who is or who isn't part of Al Qaeda or whatever terrorist group you're talking about is how a lot of these groups are organized. Okay, they're not organized like traditional organizations. When you look at Al Qaeda, there is some hierarchy. Obviously Osama bin Laden was in charge, and then there were some people under him. There was some hierarchy. But oftentimes groups like Al Qaeda and other jihadi groups can disappear and then reappear as necessary. They're sometimes referred to as what's called a dune organization, because if you think about, sand dunes, sand dunes can appear, and then all of a sudden they're gone, and they can reappear, right? With the changing of the weather, almost as if they could do it on their own, right? So these groups are kind of that same way. They pop up, they get addressed, they disappear, and they pop up over here, right? So they're kind of thought of like as these dune organizations. There was a really good article. It was in a news source that I read several years ago that I tried to find again to put it in the class, but I wasn't able to find it. If I end up finding it, I'll email it out to everybody. But it really talked about this dune kind of structure and why it works so well for these kind of groups. All right, so anyway, let's get to the 1993 World Trade Center attack. So it was perpetrated by someone who was part of this wider jihadi movement that was affiliated with Al Qaeda. So the perpetrators were affiliated with Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, who's also known as the Blind Sheikh. A lot of times he's referred to as the Blind Sheikh. And if you spend any time at all reading about, jihadi terrorism in America, you're sure to come across his name a fair amount. Anyway, so the person who pulled off the World Trade Center bombing was actually accused of being the getaway driver for the assassin of Meir Kahane. Now you should remember his name. We talked about him not too long ago. So if you look at, and there's quite a bit here in this chapter, and that's one of the things with this chapter is there's so much kind of in here to unpack. There's really no way that I can cover all of it in a video. But if you look at the reasons for committing the attack, they're fairly common among jihadi terrorists. America is a terrorist nation. The U.S. is indiscriminately killing people around the globe. There's a Jewish influence in American institutions that is unacceptable, and also viewed America as a secular country that was hostile to religion, especially Islam. All right, so you have the third case study. Looks at Hamas and suicide bombings, and even opposed to the other two sections, there's a lot to unpack here. But I'm gonna try to kind of talk kind of generally about this and keep this video to a reasonable length. So the main target of Hamas is Israel. They are on the other side of this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Hamas started kind of as a movement in the late 80s, then expanded in the 90s. At that time, it was still somewhat decentralized, but began to really develop more of a sophisticated structure, and it had political and military wings. So these suicide bombers were in cells within this military wing. It was very secretive. Most outsiders had no idea if someone was actually part of these cells until they committed their bombing. So then in the early 2000s, two Hamas leaders were killed, and when that happened, they gained martyr status, and this really kind of invigorated the Hamas movement, and it led to Hamas winning quite a few seats in the legislature, with their political wing. They ended up winning 74 out of 132 seats in the legislature. And obviously that was a cause for concern, well, certainly in the West, and even for people within Palestine. They're really worried about Hamas having that much power, because not everybody supports Hamas because of their known militant activities. But on the other hand, they also provide humanitarian aid to those in the West Bank. So some people will support them because of this humanitarian aid that they supply, and also because they think that Hamas serves as a check on other members of the government and other groups within the government. So even if somebody doesn't explicitly say, that they support Hamas, there is a fair amount of support for Hamas for a variety of different reasons, in spite of some of the militant stuff that they do. All right, so getting back to the suicide bomber thing. So why would somebody become a suicide bomber? Well, first, if you read what the Hamas Rantisi said, they shouldn't be called suicide bombers. They should be called self-chosen martyrs. And if you look at just titles, that's a pretty powerful thing. Just changing the name of something could change how people view it. So if you change it from suicide bomber to self-chosen martyr, that sounds very, very different, right? So if you're a self-chosen martyr, you have chosen yourself to be part of something bigger than yourself that you're willing to give your life for. So if you read the descriptions by Juergensmeyer, it's obvious that these bombers believed very, very deeply that they're doing God's work when they commit those acts. And Hamas views this as that they're in a war, not only with the Israeli government, but with the whole of society. And they're viewing these bombings as defensive rather than offensive. And they also stated that these bombings were a moral lesson for Israel because they want Israel to feel the same pain that the Palestinians feel. So think about that for a minute. Visions of being at war with both spiritual and political implications. Some of that should start sounding pretty familiar to you from things we've read in other weeks. So then finally, Juergensmeyer discusses modern justifications for Islamic violence. In the Quran, like most religious texts, there's both justifications for violence as well as prohibitions against violence. So leaders of Hamas and others have described that violence can be used not only for physical defense, but also for the defense of one's dignity and pride. Also as the defense against injustice. So this defense against injustice is a little bit of a newer interpretation, and that really kind of opens the door a little bit more for when violence uh, could or could not be used. So then Jurgensmeyer talks a few more about several different writers. The one I'm going to discuss is Farage, and he wrote a book that very clearly explained Islamic justifications for violence. So basically, he claimed that the concept of jihad or struggle within Islam was meant to be taken literally rather than allegorically, and that anyone who deviated from the moral and social requirements of Islamic law should be targets of violence, including other Muslims. And he also emphasized that true Muslims can pretty much use whatever tactics they want to achieve their goals, although there are a few limits, such as women and children should be avoided when possible. So if you commit these acts of violence, the reward is a place in paradise. So these ideas about the use of violence, not just Farage, but the other authors as well, they're widely distributed within the Muslim educational system. So it's really not surprising that many of those attracted to these paramilitary groups are former students in these schools. Oftentimes, the view on these Islamic terrorists and these suicide bombers are these people with no money, no education, but it really is somewhat different than that. A lot of the people that take part in these paramilitary groups are highly educated former students in these schools. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop for this week. Please be sure to read the additional articles included in Blackboard, complete your assignments, and I'll see you next week.